Hello AP history students, and welcome to another session of AP Euroblast. As always, I'm here to spark your interest in European history, activate your memory, and draw connections. Today we're going to continue with the story of Fort Mosé in Spanish Florida as part of our series on Black Lives in European History. In the previous episode, we looked at the very different roles that Black people played in Spanish Florida and British Carolina and Georgia. And we saw how those differences led to frequent warfare between the two European powers from the late 17th to the late 18th centuries. And we also saw how those differences led to frequent and sizable migration from bondage in Carolina to freedom in Florida. Fort Mosé, the first free Black town in the United States, established just outside St. Augustine, was part of this larger picture. It was home to approximately 100 free Black soldiers and their families for about 13 years. St. Augustine had been home to many of these people for even much longer, since its foundation in 1565. Others had arrived much more recently from Carolina and Georgia. So, who exactly were these brave men and women who risked so much and then served Spain so faithfully? Many of the men and women of Spanish Florida, and especially those who fled Carolina, were African-born. They came from as far north as the southern regions of modern-day Mali and from as far south as northern Angola. But the boundaries of the African states they came from changed over time. Therefore, it's more helpful to look at the different groups of people in Fort Mosé culturally rather than politically. Most identified ethnically as one of three groups. So first, there were the Congos. Remember Don Miguel and the Kingdom of Congo? That was the one from the first video on Black lives in 16th to 18th century Iberia. No? Well, it was still around. Here are the regions relative to today's political map. It was centered in Angola, but extended into today's Democratic Republic of the Congo to the east, and the Republic of the Congo and Gabon to the north. The second biggest group was the Kalabari, from farther north in modern-day Nigeria. And from still farther north, centered in modern-day Mali, was the third largest group, the Mandinka. There were several other people as well, and all of them could be further subdivided. Suffice it to say that the people of Fort Mosé were culturally diverse, and it was a very racially mixed community as well. Although women and even children successfully fled Carolina to Florida, there were always fewer of them. So the men of Fort Mosé found marriage partners in two groups. Either the free Black enslaved women of St. Augustine, or the native women of two nearby native villages. Now just think of what communication must have sounded like in this polyglot community. The people of Fort Mosé spoke a variety of Native American and Native African languages, as well as European ones. And this was one more thing that made them useful to Spanish rule. It helped to assimilate new arrivals and in communicating during liberation raids of Carolina. But for all its diversity, the community became very tightly knit. The shared experience of having been torn from their homelands and cultures, of the horrors of the Middle Passage and of slavery, brought them together. And they used familiar African notions of kinship to make new ties. And they also used Spanish Catholic practices of kinship to draw themselves even closer. Specifically, they publicly witnessed each other's weddings. They became godparents to each other's children and buried each other according to Catholic ritual. And in between, periodic celebrations of Catholic feast days marked the calendars of their lives. They also formed strong ties through ritualized extended family formation. This was known as compadrazgo, and they did this for mutual assistance in times of need. Now, we know all of this because of their active participation in two Spanish institutions, the church and the military. True to their word, the people of Fort Mosé were good Catholics, or at least they tried to be, according to the best of their understanding of their new faith. And the Catholic Church kept excellent records of the major events of their lives, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Records also indicate the Church's occasional frustration with people praying in African languages rather than in Spanish, and blending African traditions into Catholic ones. But the consistency of the participation in church rituals, as well as Catholic social practices like compadrazgo, point to the sincerity of their attempts to be good Catholics. Second, the battle record shows that they were fierce soldiers and loyal subjects. Several personally participated in the freeing of new members and raids on Carolina, and since there are many instances of local slaves later becoming free, it would seem that they also assisted one another locally in achieving freedom. Professor Landers has several individual accounts of these types of relationships, so check the description box at the end of the video. Now, we know all of this from what the British and the Spanish officials wrote, but we also know it from what they wrote in their own voices, and in at least a few occasions, in their own handwriting. We'll examine one example in a moment, but let's pause a moment to consider what this means. Some had actually become literate in Spanish. More broadly, literate or illiterate, they had all learned how to use Spanish practices of service, petitioning, and reward. The settlers of Fort Mosé, both those who had been living for generations in St. Augustine and those who were more recently arrived from Carolina, fully understood what was at stake and what was expected of them. Since they would be the first to suffer in an English attack, either killed or injured in battle or returned to slavery, they had a strong interest in defending Fort Mosé and St. Augustine. And they made this well known to King Philip V of Spain. Let's wrap up by taking a look at an example of what they wrote. With the zeal of new subjects, they told the king that they would be the most cruel enemies of the English and give their last drop of blood in defense of the great crown of Spain and the Holy Faith. Wow, what a great statement. And using our DBQ HAPP analysis skills, we can read it in several ways. No doubt the language reflects a point of view of intense hatred of their former plantation masters. No doubt also there may be genuine gratitude towards Spain and an enthusiasm for a culture they associated with freedom. But on the other hand, they were certainly also aware of what their audience, the King of Spain, wanted to hear, and the power he had to improve their situation. So they would want to impress him, and that would be their purpose. And this all happened in a historical context when Spain and Great Britain were frequently at war, which would have given them more leverage, or at least a better chance of being heard. And probably all of these perspectives and considerations shaped their carefully considered words. The crown needed them, and they needed the crown, and they were each aware of their mutual dependency. In closing, Fort Mosé was a small community, to be sure, and was part of a larger but still small backwater region of the Spanish Empire. But don't let that fool you as to its importance. The story of Fort Mosé and the people of St. Augustine is important for several reasons. First, it's a powerful example of how much parts of Black history have been recorded, and of how fully Black people actively participated in American, and by extension European history. And it's a reminder of how much Black lives can be made visible through persistent historical research. Second, it shows again the diversity of Black life experiences in the Americas as in Europe. They did not find their way into the top ranks of society, but in St. Augustine, they did find social mobility and they found community. And third, the experiences of Black people in St. Augustine and Fort Mosé were quite typical of the experiences of Black people throughout the Spanish Empire. Military service, the Catholic faith, racial mixing, and social advancement were part of their collective existence going back to the days of the conquest, as we saw in the first two videos. So, the stories of St. Augustine and Fort Mosé add to our understanding of the Spanish Empire, and they contribute to our interpretation of Black life stories in other times and places. Fourth, and finally, Fort Mosé and St. Augustine give us a new way of looking at U.S. history. It's refreshing to consider that the story of Black people in the United States did not start with plantations, or in 1619 with the arrival of the first 20 slaves in Virginia. We could go back another 100+ years to Juan Garrido coming to Florida with Ponce de Leon in order to begin that story. Under Spanish rule in Florida, we can say that the first 200 years of U.S. history include a much freer existence for Black people. And it was an existence that Black people actively shaped, and with it the histories of other people, white, native, and mixed as well. This has not been the dominant narrative for U.S. history, nor the experience of most Black people living in it. But St. Augustine and Fort Mosé remind us that slavery and other forms of physical and psychological brutalization were neither inevitable nor foreordained for Black people living in the United States. And how we look at our past shapes our assumptions and expectations of who we are and are still becoming. Next time, we'll take an even closer look through the story of Francisco Menendez, escaped slave, Fort Mosé's military commander, and captain of the Black militia for nearly 40 years. I hope you've enjoyed this new edition to AP Euroblast as part of the Black Lives in European History series. Please check the bibliography and suggestions for further reading in the description box. As always, please leave your own comments, including your suggestions for future episodes. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and keep learning. Thanks for watching. It's been a blast.